The article that they were referring to in the Associated Press was referring to an article you wrote back in 2015. Is that correct?
Well, so we actually wrote, I forget how long it is. It's like a 150-page report on Lower Brule that came out January of 2015. And it looked at how around approximately $25 million of federal money in various forms had been diverted for unexplained purposes. So we looked at how a few $1 million from education and social spending had been diverted, how around $1.8 million from federally funded water programs had been diverted into the general budget without explanation for how it was used, and then how the tribe had secured a federal loan guarantee of around $20 million to $22.5 million to essentially buy a Wall Street firm that would go bankrupt about a year later, and they cashed out that loan guarantee for $20 million in cash, and that money's essentially disappeared. And so this is, I mean, there was a series of transactions that the federal auditors or the auditors that they had brought in for the federal audit had caught, and then there was this WestRock deal that I explained that I was able to figure out what had happened. And so we wrote a report about all this missing money and how for years, at least since 2008, the tribal leadership under the late chairman, Mike Jandrew, had refused to disclose any information to the tribe or the public about what they were doing with this money. And when the report came out, I mean, it created a fair amount, it drew quite a bit of attention, and it led to a number of investigations and audits of the tribe, and that is partly kind of the report that came out yesterday about the OIG's report on Department of Justice money is one of the byproducts of that. So I'd been following this since about December of 2012, and the report came out and then in January 2015.
In your investigation, have you been able to follow any money trail as to where some of this money ended up?
Yeah, I mean, we found that the money for essential services had basically been diverted into the tribe's general budget. And that was, from what we understand about federal rules, that wasn't allowed. And what they were doing is instead of using it for the purposes it was meant for, it was going into their general budget, and they were spending it on things that they haven't explained. So we don't know what happened in that part of it. But with the WestRock money and the loan guarantee, the federal loan guarantee, they definitely, it looks like about $12.5 million of that $20 million was used to pay off major shareholders in the company, which, according to court documents we obtained in New York, probably included 5 members of the tribal council at that time. And so that is all of that. What we recommended is that the federal government needs to investigate all of this, because there's enough evidence there that federal funds are being diverted for the wrong purpose, and they need to get to the bottom of this.
Who is supposed to be following up on this to ensure that the dollars are being spent as they should be?
Well, so I mean, the first responsibility is the tribe itself, but the tribal government at the time wasn't disclosing any of this information. And then the second obligation is the federal government. First, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which didn't really appear to be doing a whole lot at the time to oversee this money. And that's why the Office of Inspector General for the BIA, as well as for the Department of Justice and others, started investigating it, as well as the IRS, because they were trying to get to the bottom of what had happened with all this federal money. I mean, there's roughly $1 million of funds that they've determined weren't spent or used appropriately.
Has the state gotten involved in this at all that you're aware of, or is it pretty much a hands-off thing? It's going right from federal money to reservation?
There isn't really a role for the state because it is federal money, so it would really be the federal government that has to deal with it. However, one thing to remember, and it's a related scandal and tragedy in South Dakota, is that AIII, the organization that's been kind of under scrutiny for all the GEAR Up money, was also administering the schools at Lower Brule. And in addition, when AIII was first founded, one of their first board members was the now deceased chairperson at Lower Brule. So there is a state angle to this related to the GEAR Up and AIII funding. But I mean, in terms of looking at the status of federal funds, the state government doesn't have an oversight role with those funds.
Okay, now I want to make sure I understand this correctly because I'm familiar with AIII. Are you referring to Scott Westerhuis or Stacy Phelps, or who was that you were referring to?
So both. So in one of the things we documented in our report is that there had been several $1 million diverted out of school funding at Lower Brule. And over the period of several years, that contributed to the collapse of Lower Brule schools in terms of performance. And as a result, they had to go into restructuring, which is it's a federal requirement when you have really low school performance. And so they hired AIII, Stacy Phelps, which at the time was the head of AIII, and Scott Westerhuis was the COO. So they actually brought AIII in to manage Lower Brule schools, and that had been going on for now about 2 years, and I think it's still going on actually.
Okay, and is there any documentation that they did anything, or were there just contracts in place? But
they the council members that authorized this, including the ones that were allied with the late chairman, refused to disclose what's going on with AIII there.
Okay, that's interesting because now the Department of Education has taken over Mid-Central Educational Cooperative and AIII at this point.
Yeah.
I believe it's under that umbrella.
Yeah, and so I mean, this has been something tribal members and others have been trying to get a handle on, is what exactly has AIII been doing there, and have the schools improved as a result.
Okay. What is the next step in the investigation? It's still open?
It is open. I mean, at this point, we are waiting to see what the Office of Inspector General or potentially the U.S. Attorney's Office or the IRS do about the investigations they conducted. Like the articles noted, last June there was a series of trips that investigators made down to Lower Brule to interview people and collect documents, and they requested a range of information related to payroll records, related to some of these transactions, and other grants from the federal government. So right now, we're just waiting to see what the outcome of those things are, because in our own investigation, there was clearly evidence of questionable activities that need to be addressed.
So you've been here in South Dakota. You've talked to people at Lower Brule. Mm-hmm. What are you hearing from the kids that should be getting the education in Lower Brule, and the money has somehow not made it for their education?
People are really frustrated. I mean, they've seen kind of their schools deteriorate over years. They saw that the government was really opaque and not accountable to the tribe as a whole. I mean, it was fine for people that were allies or family members or others of the leadership, but everybody else, was saying that the services and the funds and everything that was supposed to be available clearly wasn't. And that was part of the reason why I started looking into it a few years ago, is because I went out there and I saw that, and it struck me as quite odd, some of the things people were saying, and I wanted to look into it further. What happened a couple of years ago is that there were 3 new council members elected to the 6-member tribal council, and they were elected on a platform of reforming all this and openness and transparency in government. And what ended up happening is that the old school council members who were on there basically blocked them at every turn. And even after Chairman Jandreau died last April, the 2 remaining council members that were loyal to him have blocked them at every single turn. So for the last 2 years, no matter how hard they try, they're not being given access to any kind of information about government finances or anything. And basically the people who kind of benefited from the system over the last 30 years, because that's how long Jandreau was in office, have really kind of dug in their heels and refused to change. And one of the really significant things about this audit yesterday, and others that are probably coming down the pike, is it's finally kind of casting a light on what these guys have been doing for years, because the period that audit covers is prior to 2013. So it's what was happening under Chairman Jandrew and a tribal council that were really kind of all of his allies. So it's shining a spotlight into activities that were virtually secret during the time they happened.
For instance, with Mid-Central Educational Cooperative, Scott Westerhuis had a very huge house and was adding on to it and that type of thing. How about these tribal officials? Are there any links back to obvious indicators that there's an excessive amount of money that's being used or anything like in the Westerhuis housing?
I mean, whether it's the Westrock deal that we documented or the diversion of federal water funds or education funds, I mean, that's clearly with the Westrock deal, there's some indication that individual tribal council members may have profited from it. And with the other federal money, I mean, I think that's the question the IRS and OIG need to answer, is what happened to the money. Because the tribal leaders at the time wouldn't disclose what happened to it, and the only way people are going to get to the bottom of it is if these agencies investigate them. The Department of Justice investigation that came out yesterday is just a small part of a larger picture, and what's really important is that the other investigators and other agencies involved also need to get to the bottom of this. And it's critically important because this is money that was meant for schools, for assistance to the poor, for drinking water and potable water on the reservation in one of the poorest places in the state and in the country. I mean, Lower Brule is not a wealthy place by any means. And so it's really tragic that what's getting attention is how kind of long-standing and entrenched leadership there did this in secrecy and at the expense of its own people.